Today I received a very honest and vulnerable comment from someone, and I think it's very relevant. I think it's worth discussing. I think we need to be challenged today in this video to talk about this openly. The comment was from someone who admitted they were always skeptical towards Middle Eastern people. And you can imagine the irony. They take the DNA test, the results show that they themselves are part Middle Eastern, and it wasn't like just 1%, it was a decent amount. They had to then reevaluate their feelings toward Middle Eastern people because they are part Middle Eastern now. And I wanted to, and I've already done this a few times, I talk about how as Americans, I feel that we're fed somewhat of an agenda through the news to believe that because we are the military leader of the world, we've got over 700 bases across the world, we're helping police the world, we're helping defend America all the time. We're always at war with someone. We've always got to have an enemy. Back in the 80s, it was still that Cold War going on with the Russians, and we have to send Rocky to go fight the Russian and beat him to symbolically end the Cold War. Well, now we're still fighting the Middle Easterners and the Muslims because of those terrorists on 9/11. But in reality, that's not, I think that that's the need to have this enemy. In reality, when I think of any Middle Eastern person I've ever met, I think of someone who is very kind, big heart, someone I love being around. Every Middle Eastern person I've ever met, any Muslim I've ever met, any Middle Eastern Muslim I've ever met, that's always been the case. So for me, it's always been hard to really look at all the Middle East and think that, oh, well, they're just all bad. No, there's some exceptions to the rule that are terrorist, and I think they give everybody else a bad name and cause us to be skeptical. You know, and it's just a new form of what has always happened, you know. Civil rights movement in the 60s, people finally got over that, right? And then there was still, I think, post-Vietnam, there was skepticism toward maybe Asian people. And now this with Muslim people. And it's like every generation has its new group of people to be skeptical towards. But it's quite interesting and ironic now that we're taking these DNA tests. Perhaps fate would have it that the people group that we're maybe the most skeptical towards might be the one that just happens to show up on our DNA test, even though we would have never guessed it. And it's funny because I can personally relate to the whole surprise you're Middle Eastern, because that happened to me too this summer when I took my MyHeritage DNA test. Turns out my Italian grandfather was something like half Sephardic Jewish, but the other, something like half of him was like half Middle Eastern. And so I can relate to that. And apparently, because it was through the Italian side, and that's one of the main things I've learned this year, that Italians ethnically, you can't expect just to be 100% Italian. You're a mix, and Middle Eastern is a predictable part of that mix of Italian people. So it is interesting, and I just really appreciate that comment because it's something that we should talk about. It's one of those things that these DNA test results force us to come to terms with, despite how easy culture might make it for there to be an enemy or someone that we treat with skepticism, we can't do that. It's funny because for me, growing up in the South, you know, my mother, whereas the one parent was half Middle Eastern, half Jewish for the most part, the other, her mom was Mexican. And so I remember growing up in high school and in Alabama, and I'd hear people say, well, all these Mexicans need to start learning to speak the language and they need to stop taking our jobs. And I was thinking, I don't think they know that my grandmother's Mexican, and I don't feel that way towards Mexicans, you know. But once you realize that you are part of that outsider, whoever they are, that outside group, you can't ever see things the same way. And it forces you to come to terms with that. And would we be able to come to this realization if it weren't for these DNA tests? They show us that we're more ethnically diverse than we realize, which therefore forces us to become more accepting of other ethnic backgrounds, even if our own news wants us to believe that a whole group of people are the enemy, even though most Muslims are actually, I think, in Indonesia, so they're actually Asian. But we need an enemy. We already beat the Russian in Rocky IV, so now we've got to do this. We've got to keep policing the world. We've got to keep our 700 military bases so we can keep all the terrorists at bay and make sure no one attacks our country again. That's the American news agenda. And I've talked about it before, but I really think that for our generation, what's going on, they want us to think that Middle Eastern people and Muslim people are the enemies. And I refuse to accept it. I love Muslim people. I love Middle Eastern people. And I'm sure apparently my grandparents somewhere up the line felt the same way because they themselves were Middle Eastern and Muslim. I'd have to think so.